Okay, now can we create properties also for our class and then access those properties as well? Okay, let's see something here. Okay, alright, maybe this is good. Okay, so yes, you can add your own properties to your class. Remember, a property is something that changes or sets a value. So it's examples are the text in a text box, changing the background color of a form, and setting a button to enabled. Okay, so they say you can get values from a property. Means you can read the like the text property of a text box and put that into a variable, so you can get the value from a property, and you can set them. In other words, you can set the text box .text property, right? So for a text box, you can set the text to appear in the text box, or you can get what text is inside the text box and assign that to a value, a variable. So, but notice they're using these two words, get and set, and they're bold here and made big because we're going to use them those words in a special way, or we're going to use those words. You can use these same words, get and set, when you're creating your own properties. An example might clear things up. Okay, so you should do this. So add a picture box to your form. Set the size mode property of the picture box to stretch image. You've done that a long time ago. Click the image property and add the planet JPEG image from the files you downloaded at the start of this book. Okay, so you don't have such a thing. So just create an image. You can download an image from the internet or whatever, and set the image property of this picture box to this image. Add two text boxes to the form. Two text boxes. Change the name of the first one to text height. So it's a text box and the name is height, or text height, and the other one to text width. So we're going to have two text boxes. One has a name of text height, the other has a name of text width. Enter 300 as the text for both text boxes. So that means the text property, I think. Add two labels to the form. Set the text of the first one to height and the second one to width, and move them next to the text boxes. Add a new button to your form. Set the property, the text property, to change height and width. So this button is going to take the height and width that the user enters into these two text boxes and change the height and width of this picture box. So do that. Okay, so we did that in the form, but we are actually interested in doing something with our class, right? We set something up in the form, but we're really learning today about the class, so we want to do something in the class. And he says that VB needs to know that you want to set up a property for your class. Okay, so that's what we want to do. We don't want to set up now a method. We already did that twice anyway. We're learning how to set up a property for our class. So the way that you do that is you type public property and then after some spaces end property. Okay? So we have to go to the code for our class. So here's the class. Here's the form. But your class has much more in it than this one does. But anyway, you go to the class, type a few lines of space between the end sub of your doMessageBox method and the line that reads end class, and on a new line type the following. So we want to put this in after the method that the last method that we typed in. Okay? So we're saying we're going to be creating a property. It's going to be public, and it's going to be called change height. Now this looks a little strange because properties don't have this, right? Those are for methods, but we're creating the property here. This is not the way we access the property. So you have to do this. And the type of property is going to be an integer. It's not a string or whatever else. It's an integer. Okay, so this change height property is going to be an integer. So he says change height is the name of our property. It's just something we made up ourselves. So the height, you could call it anything you want. After a pair of round brackets, you add the type of value that will be returned. Just like with the function we did that. Here we want to return an integer. When you press the return key after typing this line, VB finishes off the rest of the code stub for you. So let's see if that really works, because last time I tried it. Let's see if I put this in there. So I don't know why, but for some reason it doesn't work when I do that. And I'm not sure why that is. So I don't know if it works for you or not. So you may have to type it in yourself. There could be some kind of setting that would cause it to fill in the code stub, and I don't have it set properly. I'm not sure. But anyway, you may have to type this all in yourself, including in addition to this. Okay? Before the code is explained, add a new variable at the top of your code, just below the public class convert post code. Add this. So this is supposed to go before this. I'm sorry, it's supposed to go after that. Just below it, though. Just below it. So this goes just below it, not before it. Pardon me. The word private means that only code inside the class can see this variable. So we're creating a variable, but it's private. Means that only code inside the class can see it. You can't access this code directly from a button on the form. So you could create an object of this type. We did that already, but you cannot say, oh, I want to access int height, because it's private. So it's only in the class. Okay, so we can't get at it at all. So you might say, well, why do you want it? But we'll see. The reason the variable is right at the top is so that other chunks of code can see it and use it. So your coding window should look like this. So we have the name of the class, and then right after that we have this. Then we had the function that we wrote called doConvert. Then we had the sub procedure that we wrote called doMessageBox. And now we have the public property with all of this stuff here, which we haven't made clear yet. And it's not finished yet either. So he says that if you don't have this part, which we haven't talked about yet, then all we have is this and the end. He says the reason the get and set are there is so that you can set a value for your property and get a value back out. To set a value, the code inside a property is this. So wait, before we say that, this is what we have so far. That's just the blank, that's just the code stub, so to speak. It's just that nothing doesn't do anything yet. Now what are we going to do? We're going to change it to this. Now this doesn't make so much sense, but look, this is the input into set, and we're setting this variable that we created up above. Now later what we're going to do is with the get is we're going to, if this variable, which was private, remember, is set by the set property, then we can, if we want to use it, we feed that into this, which remember is the name of our property. So we feed it into the name of our property, and then so our property gets that value. So that's kind of the logic here. Alright, let's go back and study this set a little bit more carefully. So here it is again, set, and we notice that it takes a value, so it takes a parameter which we'll call value, and that should be an integer. And it's doing this by value, which we're already familiar with. And then we just have that. And then we haven't put in the other part of the code yet, but the set word is followed by a pair of round brackets. Inside the round brackets is the by value, value as integer. This is just like a sub when you hand it over a value to it. The name of the variable, value, is a default name. You can change it to anything you like. The type of variable, as integer, is also a default. You don't have to pass numbers to your properties, but in this case that's what we want to do. If you want your property to handle text, you might have something like this instead as string, but that's not what we're doing. But you couldn't do this. In other words, you can't have it except two variables. That's not what a property can do. Okay? In other words, you can't pass two values to your property. Functions, you can, but in this particular context, this is a kind of a function. But anyway, for this, in this particular context, you can't do that. You can only pass one value. But we want to pass a number to our property. For us, this value will come from the text box on the form. Whatever number is inside the text box will get handed over to our property. Okay, but we need to use this value being handed over. We can assign it to that variable we set up at the top of our class. So add this to your code. So this is what we said. So we're going to take the input from this set and assign it to that new variable that we put up here, this new variable up here. He says this is known as writing to a property. So when we set this value to this integer variable, or to this variable, we're writing to a property, or writing to this property. To read from a property, you use get. So this will get a value back out of your property. The code stub for this is here. Just, it's simpler than the code stub for the set, right? The code stub for the set was this part and this part without this. This is simpler. He says you don't need any round brackets for the get part. You're just fetching something, you're just getting something to be read. Okay, now we add the line in bold to the get statement. So like we said, we might have set this variable using the set property, and once we've set it, if we haven't set it, I guess the property doesn't have anything in it, so we're not going to assign it to anything either. But if we have set it, then we might want to get it. So then it makes sense to read that variable. If we so we read the variable like this, and we saw something similar to this before when we were returning a value from a function. We used this kind of thing before. The value that we wanted to return, we set it to the name of the function. That's what we're doing here, the name of our property this time. So we saw this before when we were returning a value to a function, from a function. Now we're doing basically the same thing. We're returning this value through the get, because we want to get it, and the name of the property is this. So we're setting this value to that. Okay. So he says all you're doing here is returning a value, just like you did with a function. You're handing a value to whatever name you called the property. We called ours changed height. It's an integer, so we can pass whatever value was stored in inside of this over to, I wouldn't say over to the variable called changed height, I would say over to whatever. I don't think this is called a variable. Over to, but maybe it is since we're assigning it. I don't know. Anyway, we're assigning, we pass over whatever's in here into here. Okay. And just like with the function case, we, instead of referring to the name of the function, we can just use return. So you can also do that here. Return this thing instead of sending it to here. So these will do exactly the same thing. Whether you do this or you do this, will do exactly the same thing. Okay, next he says, let's see how to use our new property. But before we do that, let me just say something. Two things, I think. First of all, do you remember when we talked about structures? And structures also had fields, and we could set those directly. Yeah, we didn't have to use something like get and set. We could just access them and set them directly. And Java actually allows you to do that with your properties as well. But they strongly encourage you not to do it that way. Not to be able, because what you're doing is you're making that field or this property public, and then it can be easily accessed, and that's not a good practice. So I guess Microsoft doesn't want to even allow that to happen, so they make it a little bit, well, they enforce this using of get and set. Java doesn't enforce it, but basically you're supposed to use the same methodology in Java as well when you're creating a property. One more thing is, for homework assignment, I'd like you to try to think of a object that could have a function, or a method rather, and a property that might be useful in your project. So I want you to try to think about that and then describe how it could be used. Now, I'm not saying you have to use it in your final project, but I'd like you to think about how. Now, that's very different than learning how this works, right? You learn how it works, but you don't really know why you need to do it, right? So you can understand how this works, but actually designing an object, creating an object, and deciding what object to create is a completely different question, right? So, but I want you to try and think about that. That's like a real programming question. It's kind of, programming is partly a science, but it's partly an art, meaning you can do it in different ways, and you sort of have to decide how you want to do it. You have to design your program the way you want it to work. So so there's a kind of an art to it. So there's kind of various possibilities, and you can choose to design it the way you want. Now, usually, like for example, they always say that you could create an object called a student, and the student would have a name property and a ID property and lots of different properties, and the student might also have some functions. For example, it might have a function where it could register for a class or things like that. Anyway, this is kind of very hard, I think, but I'd like you to try and think about it. So how could you create, what object might you create, and maybe what property and method or properties and methods would that object have so that it might be useful in your program. So please send that as a Word document along with your homework assignment for this week. Okay, let's stop this video, and then we're going to talk about how we can use our new property.